Alright, so we looked at Mexico and the single party rule of the PRI. We looked at Guatemala and a mostly Amerindian society that is dominated by foreign companies and a few rich, large landowners in its country. But what about Cuba? Cuba is a very different situation. It differed from Guatemala. Here we have a large Spanish and African slave descendant population. Not so many Amerindians that we'll see in the other places, but a large Spanish and African American or African slave descendant population. They have a larger middle class. They have a relatively high literacy rate in health care. So at this point, you ought to be asking me, okay, Mr. McKernan, how could they move towards revolution? If, as you're saying, they have a larger middle class, seem to be doing a little better, better educated, better health care. The problem for Cuba, and you'll notice Cuba's right here in red, just off the coast from Florida. Cuba has a huge disparity between its urban and its rural people. And you'll notice over a history that when there's a huge disparity in wealth, it frequently leads to unsettling domestic issues, unsettling domestic policies. So what happens here? All right. Well, there's a revolution in 1959, and Fidel Castro takes over. Now, he turns Marxist-Leninist. Notice I've got planned or not. The bottom line here is it's real unclear whether Castro intended to be, originally when he took over, intended to be a communist, or whether he switched because of opposition from the United States. He always sort of claimed that the U.S. pushed him towards the Soviet Union. Others argue that he probably would have ended up there anyway. So bottom line is we're not sure. But we do know a couple things. First of all, foreign properties are expropriated. What that means is that he takes over foreign-owned companies' lands in Cuba and says they belong to Cuba, not to foreigners. He collectivizes farms and land. Now, we've been through collectivization. We've looked at it. We're going to look at it in China. We've looked at it in Russia. We're going to look at it in Cambodia, and every time it fails. He also creates a centralized socialist economy. He tries to follow sort of the 5-year plan of the Soviet Union. He broke contact with the United States and gains the Soviet Union as a protector. He really, really needs that. He really needs the Soviet Union as a protector because, as we're going to say here in a little bit, without them, he would have collapsed. So, he survived in the 60s really with the support of the Soviet Union, or he would have failed. I just said that. Sugar prices fluctuate, and he can't afford oil. Cuba doesn't have oil, and it needs oil, and its main export product is sugar. So we're going to talk about that. Now, we're also going to talk about we did talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis down here, and this is a map showing Cuba with the missiles on there that he got from Khrushchev. That's the man. This is Fidel Castro, standing next to Khrushchev in the early 1960s. The United States is very, very active, and we have a continuing presence in this part of the world. We're there a lot. So my next few slides are giving a brief history of U.S. involvement in Latin America. Okay, let's pick up from the end of World War I with our history of U.S. involvement in Latin America. First off, by the end of World War I, we are the unquestioned leader in Latin America. We replaced which nation was our rival in this part of the world in the 1800s and the 19th century? That's right, Great Britain was. Now, we intervened frequently with our military in order to protect our U.S.-owned properties and investments. There are over 30, notice 30 military interventions in Cuba before 1930. If you remember, it goes all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt and the walk softly, carry a big stick philosophy. Why do we get involved? Usually it's to protect U.S.-owned companies and U.S. investments. So you have companies like United Fruit Company and other companies in Central America who need protection. U.S. sometimes has contributed through military and through the CIA to the assassination of certain leaders in Latin America. Now I want you to put yourself from the point of view of Latin America. Now think about this, guys. 30 times before 1930, we've been involved. We've helped assassinate rulers. How do you think they feel about us? What do you think they feel? That's right, there's some resentment there. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you resent if somebody was becoming involved in your situation? Led to what we call banana republics. I know, it's a store as well, but it's more than just a store. Banana republics, they get the nickname banana. Banana comes from the fact that it's a frequently grown fruit in this part of the world, and republics because they all claim to be republics. They're puppet governments controlled by the United States. So banana republics, we influence them. But in the 1930s, things seemed to start to change for Latin America. Remember, after World War I, it's the United States. The United States is the main dominating force. Then we're very, very involved. In the 30s, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, decides that we're going to institute something called the Good Neighbor Policy. The Good Neighbor Policy says we're going to be better people to you. We're going to stop intervening. We're going to leave you alone a bit more, and we're going to try to be nicer neighbors. But you know from chapter 31, all that changes after World War II, right? That's what number 5 talks about. But communism changes everything. The Cold War makes it important again. Now we're going to get very involved because, not just because of U.S. business interests, but also, and very, very heavily, because we want to suppress communism in this part of the world. So it leads to things like a belief that maybe if we invest, like we did with the Marshall Plan, you remember the Marshall Plan from chapter 31, a belief that if we invest like the Marshall Plan, there'll be an improvement in their economies, and this will prevent those extreme leftist or right-wing groups from coming into power. We have something we call the Alliance for Progress, where we'll give up to $10 billion for helping their economies. Yes, that's billion with a B. Not really very successful. It's not a very successful program for a variety of reasons. Mismanagement, unintended consequences, these kind of things. But it really doesn't help them out that much. In the 80s, there's increasing violence. The U.S. decides that it's going to support conservative governments. Particularly under Ronald Reagan, we become very involved in Central American politics with the CIA actually overthrowing some democratically elected communist parties, a group called the Sandinistas, who were elected to power by the nation. We actually used the CIA to support their enemies and try to overthrow them. In 1989-90, we even invade Panama under the first George Bush to put in a more cooperative regime. Now, get this picture, guys, please. U.S. has been involved repeatedly in Latin America. We have the brief interlude in the 30s where FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, tries to establish the Good Neighbor Policy. Then the Cold War comes along. Please, please remember, the Cold War is driving a lot of U.S. decisions between 45 and 92, 91, when the Soviet Union collapses. It drives a lot of our foreign policy decisions. Okay? We'll stop here and we'll pick up with chapter 33.